Picture this, you're a highly trained military officer sitting in a secure briefing room when the worst possible news arrives. Your commanding officer, the person you trust most in this dangerous world, has been captured deep behind enemy lines. The official word comes down quickly. No rescue mission will be authorized. The risk is too high. The location is too dangerous. He's on his own. But what if that captured commander isn't just your superior officer? What if he's also your husband? This is the impossible choice that faced Captain Maria Santos on a cold morning in Afghanistan, when she learned that Colonel James Santos had been taken by Taliban fighters during what should have been a routine supply convoy escort. In that moment, Maria had to decide between following orders and following her heart, between being a good soldier and being a devoted wife, between accepting the military's decision and taking matters into her own hands. What happened next would challenge everything the military thought they knew about courage, loyalty, and the lengths one person will go to save another. This is the true story of how a decorated officer threw away her career, violated every rule in the book, and walked alone into the most dangerous territory in Afghanistan to bring back the man she loved. Some called it the most reckless mission ever attempted. Others called it the most heroic. But Maria Santos called it the only choice she could live with. This is her story. The morning started like any other at Forward Operating Base Chapman in eastern Afghanistan. Captain Maria Santos was reviewing intelligence reports in her small office when the radio crackled to life with routine traffic. Supply convoys, patrol updates, weather reports, the usual chatter that filled the airwaves of a busy military outpost. She barely paid attention until she heard the call sign that made her blood run cold. Viper 6 is down. Repeat, Viper 6 is down. Viper 6 was Colonel James Santos, her commanding officer and husband of 8 years. Maria's coffee cup crashed to the floor as she lunged for the radio, her heart hammering against her ribs. The next few minutes brought a flood of panicked transmissions that painted a nightmare scenario. The convoy had been traveling along Route Bravo, a supposedly secure road that connected their base to a remote village where they were delivering medical supplies. James had been leading from the front, as he always did, when the attack came. The Taliban fighters had chosen their ambush site perfectly, a narrow valley with high walls on both sides that turned the road into a killing zone. The first explosion had disabled the lead vehicle, James's armored Humvee. Rocket-propelled grenades rained down from the while automatic weapons fire poured from concealed positions. The convoy's return fire was fierce, but limited by their position in the valley floor. Within minutes, smoke was rising from 2 vehicles, and the radio was filled with desperate calls for medical evacuation. "We need immediate air support," shouted Sergeant James's driver and bodyguard. "The colonel is wounded and we're surrounded." Maria grabbed her gear and ran for the operations center, where she found chaos. Officers were shouting orders, radios were crackling with updates from the battlefield, and large screens showed drone footage of the ambush site. She could see the burning vehicles like tiny toys scattered across the valley floor, surrounded by dozens of muzzle flashes from enemy positions. General, the base commander, was coordinating the response. Apache helicopters were already in the air, racing toward the fight. A quick reaction force was loading into vehicles for a ground assault, but Maria could see the grim expressions on everyone's faces. The ambush had been perfectly planned and the Taliban fighters weren't running. They wanted something. "Status report," barked at the radio operator. "Sir, Bravo team is reporting heavy casualties. They've lost 2 vehicles and are taking fire from multiple positions." Viper 6 was last seen being dragged from his vehicle by unknown fighters. The words hit Maria like a physical blow. She watched the drone feed, searching desperately for any sign of James among the chaos below. The Apache helicopters arrived and began their attack runs, sending rockets into the enemy positions. Explosions bloomed along as the gunships worked to suppress the ambush. But it was too late. By the time the attack helicopters had cleared the area and the quick reaction force had fought their way into the valley, they found only empty enemy positions and the burning remains of the convoy. 3 soldiers were dead, 7 were wounded, and Colonel James Santos was gone. The search began immediately. Drones scoured the surrounding mountains while patrols swept through nearby villages. The Afghan National Army was contacted, local informants were questioned, and every available intelligence asset was focused on finding the missing colonel. But the Taliban fighters had vanished into the rugged terrain like ghosts. Maria threw herself into the search effort with desperate energy. She worked 18-hour days, analyzing intelligence reports, coordinating with local sources, and pleading with anyone who might have information. She studied satellite imagery until her eyes burned, looking for any clue that might lead to James's location. 3 days after the ambush, the Taliban's demands arrived through their usual channels. They wanted the release of 50 prisoners from airfield, including several high-value targets. In exchange, they would return Colonel Santos unharmed. If their demands weren't met within 1 week, they would execute him. The response from higher command was swift and final. The United States military does not negotiate with terrorists. The policy was clear and non-negotiable. Colonel Santos was a prisoner of war, and while every effort would be made to locate and rescue him, no prisoner exchange would be considered. Maria felt her world crashing down around her. She requested a private meeting with General, hoping to convince him to authorize a rescue mission. She had located several possible hideouts in the mountains where James might be held. With the right team and equipment, they could attempt a surgical strike to free him. His office was decorated, with maps of the region covering one wall and photos of fallen soldiers covering another. The general was a combat veteran with 30 years of experience, and his weathered face showed the weight of command as he listened to Maria's proposal. "Captain Santos," he said gently, "I understand what you're going through, but we've analyzed those locations, and they're all in heavily defended territory. Any rescue attempt would likely result in the loss of the hostage and significant casualties among the rescue team. I can't authorize a mission with such low probability of success." "Sir, with respect, that's my husband out there," Maria replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "We can't just abandon him." "We're not abandoning him," said firmly. "Every intelligence asset we have is focused on finding Colonel Santos, but I won't send more soldiers to their deaths on a suicide mission. The answer is no, Captain, that's final." Maria left the general's office feeling hollow and defeated. She walked through the base in a daze, past soldiers going about their daily routines, past the dining hall where she and James had shared countless meals, past the small chapel where they had been married in a simple ceremony years earlier. Maria's transformation from grieving wife to determined rescuer began in the pre-dawn hours of the 4th day after James's capture. While the base slept around her, she sat in their quarters with maps spread across the floor, intelligence reports stacked beside her laptop, and a growing sense of purpose replacing the helpless despair that had consumed her since the ambush. She knew the clock was ticking. The Taliban had given a 1-week deadline, and 3 precious days had already passed with no progress from the official search efforts. Every hour that went by reduced James's chances of survival and increased the likelihood that his captors would move him to an even more remote location. The first challenge was intelligence. Where exactly was James being held? The official search had identified several possible locations in the mountains northeast of the ambush site, but none had been confirmed. Maria pored over every piece of available information: satellite imagery, intercepted radio transmissions, reports from local informants, and analysis from the intelligence specialists. One location kept drawing her attention: a remote compound called Village, built into a mountainside about 40 kilometers from where the convoy had been attacked. It was accessible only by foot along treacherous mountain paths, surrounded by natural defensive positions, and known to be sympathetic to Taliban fighters. Several intelligence reports had mentioned increased activity in the area since the ambush, including of armed men and unusual nighttime movements. Most importantly, Maria had noticed something the official analysts had missed. In the satellite photos taken 2 days after James's capture, she could see fresh tire tracks leading from a seldom-used mountain road toward Village. The tracks were faint and would have been invisible from ground level, but from space they told a story. Someone had driven vehicles up that remote path recently, vehicles that could have been carrying a prisoner. The more she studied Village, the more convinced she became that James was being held there. The location fit every tactical requirement for a Taliban safe house: remote, defensible, and far from any military presence. If she was right, she had found her target. If she was wrong, she would be walking into a trap that would cost both their lives. Planning the mission itself was like solving a deadly puzzle. Maria had extensive special operations training from her years as a military intelligence officer, but this was beyond anything she had ever attempted. She would be operating alone, behind enemy lines, with no support and no backup plan. One mistake would mean death or capture, and either outcome would likely seal James's fate as well. Transportation was the first problem to solve. The official military wouldn't help her, so she needed to find another way to reach the mountains. After careful consideration, she decided to use her friendship with Captain, an Afghan National Army officer who had worked closely with their unit for over a year. Was a good man, a dedicated soldier who had lost 2 brothers fighting the Taliban. He respected the Americans who had trained his unit and had developed genuine friendships with several officers, including Maria and James. More importantly, he had access to civilian vehicles and knew the local terrain better than any American soldier. Maria approached carefully during a routine coordination meeting the next day. She couldn't tell him the full truth about her plans, but she could test his willingness to help with a hypothetical scenario. They were sitting in his office at the Afghan National Army compound, reviewing intelligence reports about Taliban activity in the region. She said carefully, "If you had to get close to Village without being detected, how would you do it?" The Afghan officer looked at her curiously. "That is very dangerous territory, Captain Santos. Why do you ask?" "Just theoretical planning," Maria replied, "in case we get intelligence about high-value targets in that area." Studied the map for several minutes, his weathered face serious. "There is an old smuggling route through the mountains," he said finally. "My grandfather used it during the Soviet War. It approaches the village from the north through a series of caves and rocky paths. Very difficult, very dangerous, but it avoids the main checkpoints." "How long would it take to reach the village using that route?" 2 days on foot, maybe 3 depending on the weather. But Captain Santos, You must understand that area is completely controlled by the Taliban. Anyone caught there would not survive. Maria nodded, filing away the information. Thank you. I appreciate your knowledge of the local terrain. That evening, she made her most difficult decision yet. She would tell the truth and ask for his help, knowing that she was asking him to risk his life and career for her personal mission. But she couldn't complete the rescue alone, and was the only person she trusted who had the local knowledge and resources she needed. She found him preparing to leave his compound and asked for a private meeting. They walked to a quiet area behind the motor pool, where the noise of generators would mask their conversation. Maria took a deep breath and made her choice. I need to tell you something in complete confidence, she began. My husband, Colonel Santos, is being held in village. I'm certain of it, and I'm going to get him back. The Afghan officer's eyes widened. Captain, that is impossible. The official search has found nothing. The official search isn't looking hard enough, Maria replied. I've analyzed every piece of intelligence we have, and all the evidence points to that village. James is there, and he's running out of time. Was quiet for a long moment, processing what she had told him. Even if you are correct, you cannot reach him alone. It would be suicide. I know, that's why I need your help. Captain Santos, you are asking me to violate direct orders from both our commands. If we are caught, we will both face court-martial at minimum. I know what I'm asking, Maria said quietly. And I know it's not fair to put you in this position, but if it was your wife, wouldn't you do anything to bring her home? The question hung in the air between them. Had been married for 15 years to a woman he adored, and he had children he would die to protect. Maria could see the conflict in his eyes as he weighed his duty as a soldier against his understanding of what love meant. If I help you, he said finally, what exactly are you planning? Maria outlined her plan. They would travel to the mountains using knowledge of the smuggling routes. She would infiltrate the village, locate James, and extract him under cover of darkness. Would provide transportation, local guidance, and a backup escape route. It was simple, direct, and almost certainly doomed to failure. This is madness, said when she finished explaining. The village will have sentries, armed guards, and possibly dozens of fighters. Even if you find Colonel Santos, how will you escape with him? He may be wounded or too weak to travel quickly. I'll figure that out when I get there, Maria replied. I can't sit here doing nothing while my husband dies in that place. I have to try. Looked at her for a long time, seeing the determination in her eyes and the desperate love that was driving her toward this impossible mission. Finally, he nodded slowly. I will help you, he said. Not as a soldier following orders, but as a friend who understands what you are feeling. We will probably die attempting this, but I cannot watch you try alone. Relief flooded through Maria. With help, her plan had the escape from forward operating base Chapman required careful timing and considerable luck. Maria had spent 2 days watching the security routines, identifying the best time to slip away undetected. She chose the early morning shift change, when guards were tired from their overnight watch and the replacement teams were still getting oriented. At 5:30 hours, while the base was still shrouded in pre-dawn darkness, Maria made her move. She had packed light but smart essential equipment only, enough food for 3 days, water purification tablets, medical supplies, ammunition, and her personal sidearm. Everything fit into a civilian backpack that wouldn't immediately identify her as military personnel. Getting off the base was surprisingly easy. She used her security clearance to access a maintenance gate that was rarely monitored, slipping out during a brief gap between patrol routes that she had timed down to the minute. Within 10 minutes of leaving her quarters, she was outside the perimeter and walking toward the rendezvous point where was waiting with transportation. Had borrowed a battered pickup truck that looked like thousands of others on Afghan roads. The vehicle was perfect camouflage, old enough to avoid attention, reliable enough to reach the mountains, and equipped with four-wheel drive for the rough terrain ahead. He had also brought traditional Afghan clothing for both of them, including a that would completely conceal Maria's identity. "Once we leave this road," told her as they drove through the sleeping countryside, "we will be beyond any help. Are you certain you want to continue?" Maria looked out at the dark landscape rushing past their windows. Somewhere in those mountains, James was being held prisoner, possibly tortured, certainly wondering if anyone was coming to save him. The thought of him waiting in some terrible cell, believing he had been abandoned, was more than she could bear. "I'm certain," she said firmly. "Let's go get my husband." The first day of travel took them along increasingly remote roads toward the mountains. They passed through small villages where curious eyes watched their vehicle, but its presence and their traditional clothing helped them blend in with local traffic. As they climbed higher into the foothills, the roads became rougher and traffic became scarcer. By afternoon, they had reached the end of the drivable terrain, parked the truck in a hidden ravine where it would be invisible from the road, and began preparing for the foot journey ahead. The smuggling route he had described was even more challenging than Maria had imagined. A series of steep trails, rocky passages, and treacherous climbs that wound through some of the most difficult terrain in Afghanistan. "My grandfather told me stories about this path," said as they shouldered their packs. "During the Soviet War, Mujahideen fighters used it to move weapons and supplies. The Russians never found it because it was too dangerous for their patrols." They began climbing immediately, following a barely visible trail that switchbacked up the mountainside through loose rocks and scattered boulders. The altitude was already affecting Maria's breathing, and she realized this journey would test her physical limits as much as her courage. Moved ahead of her with the confident steps of someone who had grown up in these mountains, while she struggled to match his pace. The first night was spent in a cave that's grandfather had used as a decades earlier. They couldn't risk a fire, so they ate cold rations and huddled together for warmth as the mountain temperature dropped below freezing. Maria lay awake for hours, listening to the wind howling outside their shelter and wondering if James was warm enough wherever he was being held. "Tell me about village," she said quietly too. "It is very old, built into the rock face like a fortress," he replied. "Perhaps 50 families live there, mostly herders and farmers. But since the Taliban returned to power in the region, it has become a stronghold for foreign fighters, very dangerous people." "How many fighters do you think are there now?" "Difficult to say. Could be 20, could be 50. They move in and out frequently to avoid air strikes. But Captain Santos, even if there are only 10 fighters, we are still vastly outnumbered." Maria knew the odds were terrible, but she had come too far to turn back now. "We'll find a way. We have to." The second day brought even more challenging terrain. They climbed through a series of narrow passes where one misstep would mean a fatal fall to the rocks below. His knowledge of the route proved invaluable. Several times he led them away from what appeared to be the obvious path, explaining that those routes led to dead ends or Taliban observation posts. By late afternoon, they could see village in the distance. It clung to the mountainside like something from another century, its stone buildings barely distinguishable from the rock face behind them. Even from several kilometers away, Maria could see why the Taliban had chosen it as a stronghold. The village commanded views of all the approaches and would be nearly impossible to assault directly. They spent the remaining daylight observing the village through binoculars, noting the locations of sentries, the patterns of movement, and the general layout of the buildings. Maria counted at least 15 armed men visible at various points, confirming that village was indeed being used as more than just a farming community. Most importantly, she spotted something that made her heart race with hope and terror. In the central courtyard of the village, a figure was briefly visible being escorted between buildings. The distance was too great to be certain, but the prisoner's height and build matched James perfectly. Her instincts had been correct. Her husband was there, somewhere in that fortress-like settlement. "I see him," she whispered too. "James is in there." Studied the village carefully through his own binoculars. "I believe you are right, but Captain Santos, look at the defenses. There are sentries on every approach, heavy weapons positions, and no cover for the final approach. How can we possibly reach him?" Maria studied the village layout, looking for any weakness in their defenses. The Taliban fighters had done their job while village was positioned and fortified like a military base. But she noticed one potential opportunity. A narrow ravine ran along the north side of the village, providing a concealed approach to within 50 meters of the outer buildings. "There," she pointed to the ravine. "If we can reach that position after dark, we might be able to get close enough to locate exactly where James is being held." "And then what? Even if we find him, how do we extract a prisoner from the middle of a Taliban stronghold?" The final approach to village tested every skill Maria had learned during her years of military training. Moving through the ravine in complete darkness, she had to navigate loose rocks, thorny vegetation, and treacherous footing while remaining absolutely silent. The slightest sound could alert the sentries positioned around the village perimeter. They reached their observation position at midnight, crouched behind a cluster of boulders that provided cover while allowing them to study the village layout. Through her night vision scope, Maria could see the details that had been invisible during their daylight reconnaissance. Guard positions, patrol routes, lighting patterns, and most importantly, the specific buildings where prisoners might be held. The village was arranged in terraces carved into the mountainside, with the oldest and most secure buildings at the highest level. Maria's attention was drawn to a stone structure near the back of the village that showed signs of recent fortification, newly installed metal doors, barred windows, and a constant guard presence. If James was being held anywhere, it would be in that building. 2 guards at the main entrance, 1 roving patrol that circles every 20 minutes, whispered, pointing out the security details. "But look there, a small window on the side that faces away from the guard positions." Maria studied the building through her scope. The window had spotted was small and high up, but it appeared to be the only unguarded access point. If she could reach it without being detected, she might be able to determine if James was inside and possibly even make contact with him. "I need to get closer," she told. "Can you create a distraction on the opposite side of the village? Something small, just enough to draw attention away from this area." Nodded grimly. "I have some firecrackers left over from Eid celebrations. If I set them off in the ravine below the village, the guards will think someone is shooting at them from that direction." They synchronized their watches and planned the timing. Would move to the far side of the village and create his distraction at exactly 200 hours. That would give Maria 15 minutes to reach the building, make contact with James, and return to their current position before the guards finished investigating the noise. As disappeared into the darkness, Maria began her solo infiltration of the Taliban stronghold. Every movement was calculated and careful as she crept up the hillside toward the village. She avoided the main paths, instead picking her way through gardens and around animal pens where the soft earth would muffle her footsteps. The building housing the prisoners loomed ahead of her, a dark mass of stone and metal that looked more like a fortress than a jail. As she got closer, Maria could hear voices from inside guards talking in low tones, the sound of metal doors opening and closing, and underneath it all, something that made her heart pound with hope and rage. She could hear James's voice, weak but unmistakably his, speaking to someone in English. He was alive, conscious, and apparently unbroken despite 6 days of captivity. Maria had to bite her lip to keep from calling out to him immediately. At exactly 200, firecrackers began exploding in the ravine below the village. The sharp cracks echoed off the mountainsides, creating confusion among the guards about the direction and nature of the threat. Shouts erupted throughout the village as fighters grabbed their weapons and rushed toward what they believed was an attack from the valley below. Maria used the distraction to reach the small window had spotted. Standing on a pile of stones, she could just peer through the bars into what appeared to be a storage room. Beyond that room, she could see a corridor with metal doors on both sides, the prisoner cells. Working quickly, she pulled a small mirror from her pack and angled it to reflect moonlight through the bars. She flashed the light in a pattern she and James had used for silent communication during previous operations. 3 long, 2 short, 3 long. The international distress signal, modified with their personal identifier. For agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then she heard movement from inside the building, footsteps approaching the storage room. A figure appeared at the inner doorway, and Maria's heart nearly stopped. It was James, thinner than she remembered and showing signs of rough treatment, but alive and alert. He had recognized her signal and managed to reach the window despite his captivity. Through the bars, they looked at each other across the few feet that separated them, and Maria saw relief, joy, and concern warring in his expression. "Maria, what are you doing here?" he whispered urgently. "This is suicide." "I'm getting you out," she whispered back. "How many guards inside?" 4, maybe 5, but Maria, you can't do this alone. They'll kill you. "I'm not alone, is with me. We have an escape route planned." Before James could respond, they heard the guards returning from investigating the distraction. The firecrackers had stopped, and the fighters were realizing that no real attack was in progress. Maria had perhaps 30 seconds before the normal guard pattern resumed. "Cell 3, end of the corridor," James whispered quickly. 2 locks, they keep the keys on a hook by the main door. But Maria, they're planning to move me tomorrow. If you're going to try something, it has to be tonight. The confirmation that James would be moved the next day eliminated any possibility of retreat or delay. This was their only chance, and they had to take it now or lose him forever. Maria squeezed his fingers through the bars, a brief moment of contact that gave them both strength for what was coming. "I'll be back in 1 hour," she promised. "Be ready." She slipped away from the window as the guards returned to their posts, making her way back to the observation point where was waiting anxiously. The distraction had worked perfectly, but now they faced the most dangerous part of their mission, actually freeing James from his cell and escaping the village alive. "He's there," Maria reported. "Cell 3, corridor at the back of the building, but we need to take out the guards silently and quickly." Studied the building through his binoculars, noting the guard positions and entrance points. "Very dangerous. If we alert the village, every fighter will come for us. We must be perfect. They spent the next 30 minutes refining their plan. Would approach from the rear of the building and neutralize the exterior guard. Maria would enter through the main door, deal with the interior guards, and free James from his cell. They would escape through the window they had used for communication, then retreat down the mountainside before the village could organize pursuit. It was a plan that required split-second timing. Perfect the assault on the prison building required absolute precision and silence. Maria approached the main entrance while moved to neutralize the exterior guard, their movements synchronized through hand signals they had practiced during their journey through the mountains. Struck first, appearing behind the roving sentry like a ghost, and rendering him unconscious with a sleeper hold before the man could raise an alarm. The guard dropped silently to the ground and dragged him into the shadows where he wouldn't be discovered until morning. Maria reached the main door as was securing the exterior. The entrance was secured with a heavy wooden bar and metal lock, but her years of special operations training had prepared her for exactly this type of obstacle. Using a compact pry bar from her pack, she carefully levered the bar free from its brackets, working slowly to avoid any noise that might alert the guards inside. The door opened silently on well-oiled hinges, revealing a dimly lit corridor exactly as James had described. 2 guards were visible, one dozing in a chair near the entrance, the other packing slowly past the row of cells. Both men were armed but relaxed, obviously not expecting any rescue attempt in this remote location. Maria moved like a shadow through the doorway, her weapon drawn but hopping to avoid using it. Gunfire would alert the entire village and turn their carefully planned extraction into a running firefight they couldn't possibly win. Instead, she relied on stealth and surprise to neutralize the threats. The sleeping guard never woke up. Maria approached from behind and applied a blood choke that rendered him unconscious within seconds. She lowered him quietly to the floor and removed his weapon before turning her attention to the second guard. The patrolling sentry was more challenging. He was alert and moving, making it impossible to approach unseen. Maria waited until he reached the far end of the corridor, then threw a small stone to create a distraction. As the guard turned to investigate the sound, she closed the distance between them and struck with the butt of her weapon. The man collapsed instantly, unconscious but alive. With both guards neutralized, Maria retrieved the keys from their hook by the door and rushed to cell 3. James was waiting, already on his feet and ready to move despite 6 days of captivity. The locks opened easily, and suddenly they were together again, embracing briefly before focusing on the desperate escape ahead. "Can you run?" Maria asked, assessing James's condition. He was thinner and showed signs of rough treatment, but his eyes were clear and determined. "I can do whatever it takes to get out of here," he replied firmly. "What's the plan?" "Is outside. We go through the back window and down the mountain using the smuggling route. But we have to move fast. These guards will be discovered eventually." They made their way to the storage room, and the window that had served as their communication point was waiting below with rope to help them climb down from the elevated position. James went first, moving carefully but quickly despite his weakened condition. Maria followed, and within minutes they were all together outside the prison building. The escape down the mountainside began immediately. Led them along paths he had memorized during their approach, moving as quickly as possible while still maintaining silence. They had perhaps an hour before the unconscious guards would be discovered, triggering a massive search effort throughout the region. For the first 30 minutes, everything went according to plan. They descended rapidly through the same ravine they had used for their approach, putting distance between themselves and village. James was keeping up well despite his ordeal, driven by the hope of freedom and the knowledge that capture meant certain death for all of them. But their luck ran out when they reached the main trail system. A Taliban patrol was moving up the mountain, apparently responding to reports of suspicious activity in the area. Spotted their flashlights in time to avoid immediate contact, but the patrol was positioned directly across their planned escape route. 6 fighters, maybe more, whispered as they crouched behind a rock outcropping. They're blocking the path to where we left the truck. Maria studied the situation through her night vision scope. The Taliban fighters were spread across the trail in a defensive formation, obviously searching for intruders. Getting past them would require either a firefight that would alert the entire region or a dangerous detour through terrain that might be impassable in the dark. "There's another route," said quietly. "Much more dangerous, but it might work. An old goat path that goes around the patrol and connects to the main trail below their position." "How dangerous?" James asked. "Steep, narrow, loose rocks. One mistake means a fall that would kill all of us, but it's our only option unless we want to fight." They decided to attempt the alternate route rather than risk a battle they couldn't win. Led them away from the main trail and onto a barely visible path that wound around the mountainside. Within minutes, Maria understood why he had called it dangerous. They were traversing a cliff face with a sheer drop to their left and loose scree that shifted treacherously under their feet. James was struggling with the challenging terrain, his strength sapped by days of captivity and poor treatment. Twice he nearly lost his footing, saved only by Maria's quick reflexes and knowledge of the safest handholds. But he refused to give up, pushing forward with the determination that had made him a successful military leader. The dangerous traverse took an agonizing hour, but it worked. They bypassed the Taliban patrol and reached the lower trail system without being detected. From there, it was a faster descent toward the hidden ravine where they had left their transportation. But as they approached the vehicle, they discovered another problem. The truck was surrounded by armed men, apparently local villagers who had found it during their absence, and were now waiting to see who would return to claim it. Maria counted at least 8 men with various weapons, making their departure far more complicated than planned. "Friends of yours?" Maria asked hopefully. "No, I don't recognize them. Probably smugglers who use this route regularly. They'll want money, or they'll want to turn us over to the Taliban for a reward." They were trapped between the patrol above and the armed villagers below, with James weakening from the prolonged exertion and dawn approaching rapidly. Once the sun rose, their chances of escaping undetected would disappear completely. Made a decision that demonstrated his courage and loyalty. "I'll approach them alone and try to negotiate. You and Colonel Santos stay hidden until I signal." "That's too dangerous," Maria protested. "If they're hostile, you'll be walking into a trap." "Perhaps, but it's our best chance. I speak their language and understand their culture. Maybe I can convince them to let us pass." Despite Maria's objections, moved down toward the truck, walking openly with his hands visible to show he wasn't threatening. The armed villagers immediately surrounded him, weapons raised, voices raised in rapid conversation that Maria couldn't follow from her hiding position. For several tense minutes, the negotiation continued. Maria watched through her scope, ready to intervene if was attacked, but hoping his diplomatic skills would succeed where violence would surely fail. James lay beside her, conserving his strength for whatever came next. finally turned and gestured for them to approach. The negotiation had succeeded, though Maria could see from his expression that it had cost something. As they reached the truck, one of the villagers spoke to in accented English. "Your friend says you are hunting the foreign fighters who took the American colonel. He says you are heroes and we should help you, but he also says you have paid us well for our silence." Maria looked at questioningly. He shrugged and patted his empty pockets. "I gave them everything I had. Money, my watch, my grandfather's ring. It was enough to buy our freedom." The villagers dispersed into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared, leaving the three of them alone with their truck and their slim chance of escape. They climbed into the vehicle and began the dangerous drive down the mountain roads, racing against dawn, and the inevitable pursuit that would begin once James's escape was discovered. The journey back to safety took 18 hours of non-stop, driving through some of the most dangerous territory in Afghanistan. They bypassed checkpoints, avoided main roads, and relied on knowledge of back-country routes that didn't appear on any official maps. James slept for most of the trip, his body finally able to rest after 6 days of captivity and one night of desperate escape. They reached the Pakistani border just as Maria's radio crackled with transmissions from search teams that had been sent to find them. The official story would be that Colonel Santos had escaped on his own and been found by a friendly Afghan patrol. The truth about Maria's unauthorized rescue mission would remain classified forever, known only to the 3 people who had lived through it. As they crossed into Pakistan and safety, Maria looked back at the mountains where they had fought for James's freedom. She had violated every rule, risked her career, and endangered life for one man. But as she felt James's hand squeeze hers, she knew she would make the same choice again without hesitation. Love had conquered duty, courage had overcome impossible odds, and Captain Maria Santos had brought her husband home. Some missions, she realized, were more important than following orders. Some battles were worth fighting regardless of the consequences, and some people were worth risking everything to save. Colonel James Santos would return to his command. Captain Maria Santos would face a lengthy investigation into her unauthorized absence, and Captain would receive a commendation for his role in discovering the escaped American prisoner. But the 3 of them would carry the memory of those desperate hours in the mountains forever, a reminder of what people will do for love, friendship, and the bonds that make us human. The rescue was over, but the story of their courage would live on as proof that sometimes the impossible is just another word for what love can accomplish. And considerable luck. But it was also their only realistic option for rescuing James before he was moved to an even more secure location. At 300 hours, they began the most critical phase of their mission. Disappeared into the shadows around the building while Maria prepared for her assault on the main entrance. She checked her weapon one final time, said a silent prayer for all their safety, and began moving toward the door that stood between her and her husband. The next few minutes would determine whether their desperate rescue attempt would succeed or whether all 3 of them would die in this remote mountain village. But Maria Santos had not come this far to fail now. James was counting on her, and she would not let him down. The final battle for Colonel Santos's freedom was about to begin, and Maria was ready to fight for the man she loved with everything she had. It was a valid question, and Maria didn't have a complete answer yet. But she was convinced that once they were close enough to assess the situation, a plan would emerge. She had to believe that because the alternative was accepting that James would die in that terrible place. As night fell over the mountains, they began their final approach to village. Moving carefully through the darkness, they descended toward the ravine that would provide cover for their reconnaissance. Every step brought them closer to the most dangerous part of their mission, and farther from any possibility of escape if something went wrong. Had been right, once they committed to this final approach, they would be completely on their own. No rescue was coming, no backup was available, and no forgiveness would be offered if they were captured. But as Maria crept through the darkness toward the village where her husband was being held, she felt no fear, only determination. James had been a prisoner for 6 days. His week-long deadline was rapidly approaching, and Maria was running out of time to save him. Tomorrow, she would either rescue the man she loved or die trying. There was no middle ground, no safe option, and no turning back. The final phase of her impossible mission was about to begin, and Maria Santos had never been more ready for a fight in her life. A real chance of success. They spent the next 2 hours working out the details: equipment, timing, routes, and contingency plans. They would leave in 2 days, giving them time to gather supplies and wait for favorable weather conditions. As they prepared to part ways, grabbed her arm. "Captain Santos, there is something you must understand. Once we begin this mission, there will be no help from anyone. If we are discovered, if we are captured, our commands will deny any knowledge of our actions. We will be completely alone." "I understand," Maria replied. "And thank you, I know what you're risking for us." The Afghan officer smiled sadly. "Colonel Santos is a good man, and you are a good woman. Perhaps Allah will watch over us in the mountains." That night, Maria began her final preparations. She would have to desert her post, steal military equipment, and embark on an unauthorized mission deep into enemy territory. In 3 days, she would either be celebrating James's return or facing a court-martial for the biggest military disaster of her career. But as she packed her gear and studied the maps one last time, Maria felt something she hadn't experienced since the ambush hope. James was out there waiting for rescue, and she was coming for him. Nothing else mattered. That night, alone in the quarters she shared with James, Maria made a decision that would change everything. She sat on their bed, looking at the photos on the nightstand, their wedding day, vacations back home, James receiving his promotion to colonel. The official military machine had written him off, but she couldn't. She wouldn't. She began planning a rescue mission of her own. It was insane, suicidal, and completely against every regulation in the military code. But as she studied the maps and intelligence reports late into the night, Maria Santos decided that some things were more important than following orders. Her husband was alive somewhere in those mountains, and she was going to bring him home, even if she had to do it alone. The military had abandoned James Santos, but his wife never would. Tomorrow, she would begin the most dangerous mission of her life, and she would either return with her husband or die trying. The plan that began forming in her mind was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. But Maria had made her choice. Love had conquered duty, and now there was no turning back.